Hello, my name is William, the avid reader, and today I'm reviewing The Coming of the Third Reich, written by Richard Evans in 2003. So this book details the rise of the Nazis and how they came to power, and it starts with the 1870s with the context of Prussia and the origins of anti-Semitism. Then it moves on to the Weimar Republic, the democratic Germany during the 20s, and it explains its weaknesses and the rise of Nazism, how it took advantage of the Weimar Republic's weaknesses. So it spans about from the 1870s to about 1933. So there are 6 sections in this book. The first section is about pre-Weimar Germany, and it discusses Bismarck after uniting Germany in the 1870s with the exception of Austria. He implements a couple of policies that discriminates against Social Democrats and Catholics. Now, the consequence of this is that the Social Democrats are radicalized, so they become much more left-wing and socialistic, and also that the Catholics, they form their own political party, center, to placate the state and basically say that even though we're Catholic, we're also German. Then there's also a chapter on the anti-Semitic roots. So originally it was more religious, pseudo-religious, with the killing of Christ being caused by the Jews. And if you look at these first anti-Semites, a lot of them are just people who have grudges against Jews or failed life. So you had a corrupt guy, he blamed his failures on Jews. You got someone who had to pay alimony or child support to his ex-Jewish wives. So a lot of this hatred is just personal problems, at least in the 19th century. And Evans emphasizes that before World War I, anti-Semitism was in the minority, and Jews were actually legally pretty much equal to other Germans since Germany was unified in 1871. Of course, Bismarck got fired in the early 1890s. His authoritarian measures were actually rolled back a bit by Wilhelm. The Social Democrats were legalized again. The Reichstag, or the parliament in Germany, they are allowed to participate more in the 1890s a little bit. And you've got the Catholics represented in the center, for example, and you've got the Social Democrats who are more left-wing, and you've also got these German liberal and conservative party who are in the center that are actually quite strong in this time of Germany's history. Then World War I comes around, and you've got this jingoism in Germany, that they want to create a big Reich, that they really expect to aggrandize Germany, but they fail. Although in 1916 you've got what is in effect a military coup, where Generals Paul von Hindenburg and then Erich Ludendorff, they are in charge of the military, and they basically run Germany between 1916 and 1918, so from 1916 until the end of the war. And they have a lot of success on the Eastern Front, but on the Western Front they're a failure. So people like to remember that Hindenburg and Ludendorff were good on the Eastern Front, and they pretend that they were good on the Western Front. So these generals facilitated the stab in the back myth. And you've got the November Revolution of 1918, and the generals gave away to the Social Democrats and democracy in November 1918, because then the blame on the loss of the war and the Versailles Treaty could be blamed on the Social Democrats and the democratic Germans, and the generals could absolve themselves of this problem and claim, hey look, we're winning the war, and then you've got this stab in the back by commies and Social Democrats and Jews. And that's when anti-Semitism really became a strong movement in Germany. And it was basically based on this, that World War I was lost by Germany because of Jews, which of course is a myth. The second section discusses Weimar democracy and how it was actually quite weak. The democratic political parties in the beginning of the Republic were actually quite strong, and they had the 2/3, 3/4 majority in the Reichstag. And the main political parties that were pro-democratic were the Social Democrats, and they always remain pro-democracy in a sense. You also had the Center Party, which were for Catholics, which, because of Ludwig Kaas and the Vatican becoming more authoritarian and liking clerical fascism, began to move away from democracy. You had Gustav Stresemann, who was the leader of the People's Party, who understood that you cannot have passive resistance against the French occupiers in the Ruhr or in the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland. And you actually have to start slowly but surely paying back reparations. And he negotiated the Dawes Plan to reduce these reparations and take out some loans by the United States. But of course, German society was opposed to this, so this undermined German democracy in a sense, even though it was necessary. You had the Democrats, which was a center-left party. They merged with some paramilitary group and became more right-wing. And the People's Party, once Gustav Stresemann died, they moved away to the right and became more authoritarian. And Richard Evans associates right-wing or far-right as authoritarian, so that's debatable, you could say. I mean, if you're libertarian, you're in a sense far-right, but you're not authoritarian. So, yeah, his terminology is maybe sometimes wrong. And then you also had the inflationary crisis in early Weimar Republic from 1919 to about 1923. Prices were skyrocketing. We have this figure who we get the perspective from, the diarist Viktor Klemperer, who is a conservative but a Jew. And from the common man or this middle class guy, we get to see how inflation was horrible and things like that. But Richard Evans doesn't really understand economics. But inflation is eventually ended in late 1923, and they start being able to pay back the reparation. But that does not change that it was a very unstable society, and that moves us on to the third section, which is the rise of Nazism. So in Bavaria, it's quite revolutionary. You have these bohemians, which is eccentric people. You had also the Spartacist uprising in Germany in general, which failed. So the communist revolutionaries, such as Rosa Luxemburg, they were killed. And then in Bavaria, you had a communist revolution, and you had social democrats and communists and different type of socialists in charge. But eventually, they were overthrown by the Free Corps. And you also had this thing where the social democrats, they disassociate themselves with this far left. So they drive a wedge between them and often side with the paramilitary. So they help the paramilitaries crush the far-left communists. So Bavaria People's Republic is over. But you also got a lot of far-right circles rising. You've got Bavarian separatism, but Adolf Hitler, he opposes this. So originally in Austria, he came to Germany just before World War I, or in the beginning, to avoid Austrian military service, but then enlisted in the German army. He was moderately hurt by poison gas, and then he came home, and this is when he really became anti-Semitic, which is ironic because he got the Iron Cross for being wounded by a Jewish officer. You've got a lot of characters that shouldn't be anti-Semitic if you look at it logically, because Jews have done some good things to them. Hitler joins the German Workers' Party, which he renames into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and he strongmans it to take it over. So you got some other people like Anthony Drexler who were initially in charge, but Hitler makes a lot of fiery speeches, and through that way, that party understands they really need him, so okay, we have him as our leader and as the dictator of the party in a sense. And then he prepares to carry out a coup d'etat, the Beer Hall Purge, which will start out in Munich and then move on to Berlin. And he brings in Erich Ludendorff, the general. You had previously a failed Kapp Purge in 1920, where the Social Democrats resisted these military officers and won. So the Reichsbanner of Social Democrats, they succeeded in defending democracy in 1920. In 1923, the Nazis, through the Beer Hall Purge, tried to take over Germany, but failed because the conservative leaders in Munich and Bavaria, who have for now tolerated the Nazis, they go, no, we're done. We're no longer tolerating your stuff. You're not taking over. So Ludendorff, he isn't prosecuted, but the army and the Nazis, they get into a shootout. I believe it was them, or it was the Nazis and the police, something like that. A bunch of people get killed on both sides. A lot of prominent Nazis get arrested, but Hitler makes a fiery speech in court, and he only gets a few years in prison and only serves about 2. During this time, he is writing Mein Kampf. He is near the fanatical follower Rudolf Hess during this time, and he gets out of prison and he meets up with some newcomers to the Nazi party. So for now you've had Goering, you've had Himmler kind of in the background, you've had this Rom, who is this military officer who really likes violence, and it's through the SA that they're beating up people, sometimes killing them. So they're disrupting rallies and they get into fights with communists regularly. So eventually Goebbels joins the Nazi party. First he's regional leader and later he becomes head of the propaganda department at the Nazis. And Hitler meets a couple other new Nazis. So you got Hans Frank, for example. He is the lawyer for the Nazis. You got Alfred Rosenberg, who served in the Russian Civil War. He's lived in the Baltics as a German there, and he's the one who introduces Hitler to this idea that you have to be anti-Bolshevik. So this is where Judeo-Bolshevism is born. You've also got the guy in charge of the Stormer, Julius Streicher, who writes all these anti-Semitic articles, and he kind of causes some damage to the party, but Hitler is like, okay, he's maybe hurting our cause a little, but he's really an extremist fanatic and he's into this, so we're going to let him do something. So the vanguard has re-established itself in the 1920s, even though they don't really have power yet. And you can see that a lot of SA members are fanatical in their commitment because they had free time, they could do whatever they want, but they decided to be National Socialists, SA members instead. And of course the SS is eventually formed also. Then the fourth section is about the Depression and also the democratic crisis in a sense, because once you have the Great Depression that rolls around in 1929, in a sense that already started in Germany in 1928, starting in 1930 you've got these conservative and centrist chancellors who take power, or increasingly authoritarian. They're economically conservative, so Evans says that these economically conservative policies were actually bad, which I would disagree with that. I mean, he even says that eventually the German economy started to recover, and it started doing that in late 1932, but it took a while, and you have to decrease wages and cut unemployment benefits if you don't have the budget to pay for it. So first you've got Hermann Brüning, who's moving Germany towards a more authoritarian tract. So he's in charge from March 1930 to May 1932. And you've got the Social Democrats who are supporting him a little bit. Then he has to resign, and Papen takes over in May 1932, and he only serves until November 1932 because he's not liked by other nationalists around him since he's a Catholic. Yeah, you've got this nationalist party which are made up of a bunch of military officers, and they're anti-Semitic, but not that strongly, and they want a military dictatorship now. But Papen, he wants the dictatorship for himself. So previously under the wing of Kurt von Schleicher, a German general, and in charge of the army basically, he tries to bring Germany to a dictatorship himself, slowly but surely. So in July 1932, he dissolves Prussia basically as a state. He becomes in charge of Prussia himself. Weimar Germany, it was a federal republic, so they had a lot of autonomy. And Prussia had a tendency of being social democratic, and it was also pretty much the majority of Germany, or about half of it. So dissolving this largest state really damaged democracy. So starting from that point, Evans has argued it was inevitable for Germany to become a military dictatorship, or a dictatorship of some kind. Either it's a military dictatorship or something else. And then in November 1932, you've got Schleicher who takes over. Kurt von Schleicher, he is a German general who has tried to tame the Nazis by bringing them into the conservative government, but he kind of fails. He makes a deal with Gregor Strasser, more left-wing Nazi, to try to form a coalition government with the nationalists, but he fails. He tries to prosecute some Nazis because he doesn't like the Nazis' domination of the army. So Nazi sympathizers who are officers are prosecuted by courts, and the courts are conservative, of course. So they've always had a bias against the left, so against Social Democrats and communists, but been pretty lenient towards the right. I believe those Nazi officers, they were punished, but they were defended by the lawyer Hans Frank, and also Hitler himself spoke there. So he makes these big speeches. But eventually, Schleicher, he kind of wants to commit a military coup, and he wants to be in charge with having Hindenburg. Oh yeah, Hindenburg, he became president of Germany in 1925. So previously the first president is a social democrat, Ebert, from 1919 to 1925. He used the presidential decree to bypass parliament. So now it's been used a lot, starting in 1930 with Hindenburg and his circle of friends. And he really likes Papen Hindenburg, so he's resentful that Schleicher removed him from power, and realizing that Schleicher may be trying to make the coup of his own and take power himself, he gets fired or is forced to resign on the 30th of January, and that is when they decide to appoint Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. They previously tried to make him Vice Chancellor, but Hitler understood that it will undermine him as this Führer, the leader, so he has to become Chancellor himself, and he does on the 30th of January. So the fifth section of this book is, now you've got Hitler trying to consolidate power. So he's in this coalition government between nationalists and Nazis, and most members in the cabinet are nationalists, but the two Nazi positions, Hitler and some other guy, they occupy very important posts. I believe the other guy is Minister of Interior, so very important rank in the cabinet. And already you've got violence that breaks out more by the SA against the left. And then you've got the Reichstag fire on the 27th of February, caused by a Dutch communist. So congrats, commies. You really sealed Germany's fate into a Nazi dictatorship. Hitler makes Hindenburg sign some things which gives the Chancellor a bunch of decree powers, and the president is a rubber stamp. And all the communists are arrested and thrown into prison. The Nazis want them killed, but the police, who are more conservative, who have been serving the Reich instead of the Republic, they're like, no, we're throwing them to prison. Although you got a bunch of left-wingers who are killed and Jews because of the hatred, the wrath of the SA. So new elections are held. So the Nazis really did well in the 1930 election, and then they improved in 1932, and they slightly went down in an election that year. But then they hold an election in the beginning of March, and the Nazis, they get, 43%? But they don't get a majority. They get a majority through their coalition with the nationalists, barely. But that means still that a large minority are opposing them. But you have to remember, now the right-wing parties are all anti-democratic, so the only Democratic Party left really much are some small centrist parties and the Social Democrats. And you got the communists, they've got about 10% who are also anti-democratic. So about 2/3 of the vote now swung to anti-democratic political parties who oppose the Weimar Republic and want to establish some other type of dictatorship. On the 23rd of March, you've got the Nazis who bring in all of the parliament members in a session. So first the parliament is inaugurated, and they make this big march in honor of President Hindenburg, this Prussian, and that they're fighting for the Bismarckian Empire, and they go to some important church in Potsdam, which is Protestant, and they're kind of pissed because the Catholics, they didn't want the Nazis in their own church. And on the 23rd of March, the parliament comes into session, and the Nazis, they want to pass the Enabling Act, which will turn Germany into a dictatorship where civil liberties are suspended. So now the police can enter your home, you have no freedom of speech, no freedom of association, and the rule of law is suspended. And the Nazis really have a hatred for the rule of law. There's an implicit threat in that if you vote against this, you're gonna get hurt. So all of the parties, except the Social Democrats, are pressured into voting for this. The communists, of course, they're not here because they've all been arrested, so they're not allowed to come. And a bunch of Social Democrats, they didn't attend the parliament session because of being afraid or arrested or sick. Every Social Democrat, led by Otto Wels, vote against this legislation. But it passes anyway. Even if the communists had been there and all left-wingers had voted against this, they would have lost anyways, and the Enabling Act would still have been passed. And now the Weimar Republic becomes Nazi Germany. Hindenburg is basically a puppet. He's the head of state, so like a king in a constitutional monarchy, he has no powers anymore really. But here it's a Nazi dictatorship, so now Hitler as chancellor with his Nazis around him, so the SA, the SS, are in charge and get to run amok They start beating up people, and they work to dissolve all the other political parties. So Social Democrats were dissolved, Communists of course removed immediately after the election, and the more right-wing and centrist parties were convinced by the Nazis to dissolve by themselves and to resign their seats, and the Nazis basically take up every seat in these different bodies of elections. So now the Nazis control all of parliaments. So after there's a similar thing, the Concordat is negotiated between Catholics and Hitler, where Catholic churches are guaranteed the rights. The Center Party dissolves, and then the Nationalists, who've been these coalition partners, they've been treated a bit better, superficially, than the others parties, but they are meant to understood. They're going to have to collaborate, and you've got Hugenberg, who is this leader of the Nationalist Party, who is like, I don't like this, I'm threatening to resign, and Hitler is like, good, you're gonna resign. And you're not withdrawing your resignation, you're resigning now. You've got the Nazis to take power in January 1933, and in July 1933, there are totalitarian states where all opposition has been crushed, the trade unions have been crushed. So the threats of the nationalists, the communists, the Catholics, and the Social Democrats have been removed. The Social Democrats have had opportunities to resist, like in 1932, but they didn't, so too late. And the only independent bodies left are the military and the churches. The final section, the sixth section of this book, is the Cultural Revolution of Hitler, or Nazism Cultural Purge. Most of the Jews are removed from the civil service and their positions in universities, and as scientists, some of them emigrate out of Germany and go to the United States or other countries. A lot of modern art is disregarded, although Goebbels kind of likes it. But Hitler wants to return to this feudal era, and these aristocratic things of leisure, now they're made available to the people. So the state is transformed into a totalitarian state where everybody is in everything and there are no independent organizations. The Nazis take over the student unions, they take over the universities, which was pretty easy since they were public institutions. Here's the problem. When you've got a public institution owned by the government, when that government turns bad, it's very easy for it to take it over. And these more liberal and left-wing institutes, which came during the Weimar democracy of the 1920s, like the sexual institutes, which are often operated by Jews, these liberal things, they are dissolved, and you've got a bunch of book burning. Einstein has to leave, and all these other intellectuals who are Jewish. A lot of books are burned, first of the sexual institute and then in the universities. And the SA is running rampant, and it's implied that Hitler is going to get the SA in check. He's let them run rampant, but he wants to have this as a one-man rule, so he will soon consolidate even more his cultural power. And that is the coming of the Third Reich. So how would I rate the coming of the Third Reich by Richard Evans? I would give it a 7 out of 10. It has a lot of good chapters, but sometimes the chapters are mediocre to okay, because first of all, Richard Evans claims that Weimar Germany was a capitalist system. It was a mixed economy in truth. Inflation wouldn't have been caused like that under capitalism, really, if it was laissez-faire. And he doesn't understand the gold standard, because they went off the gold standard after World War I, because they had to print a lot of more money, and to return to it was pretty hard, so it didn't succeed. And he thinks that Bruning's more laissez-faire economic policies were bad during the Great Depression, although the conservative economic policies started to help eventually, but they took a bit too much time for them to take effect to prevent the Nazis from taking power. And true, you can say, yeah, the conservatives really screwed up with the Nazis. But on economics, they were decent, you could say. Oh, and he says that the Nazis were not socialists. I'm sorry, but they call themselves National Socialists. They want to open up private clubs to the public. And yeah, they kind of are respecting property rights, because the more left-wing elements of the Nazi party have been purged. and Hitler is afraid of this kind of, and Goebbels is a bit more left-wing in him. But you have different types of socialism. And as Reagan said, fascism is where you have private property, but it is controlled by the state. So in a sense, that's not really capitalist, that's more socialist. And that is what I think of this book. It's a decent book, I definitely recommend it. It covers well the history of the Weimar Republic, and the Nazis aren't even brought up in the first third of the book, but they are focused a lot on the last fourth, so it's a well-balanced book, but it has some cons and it doesn't really understand economics and things like that. But otherwise, it's a decent book, 7 out of 10, so definitely read it. So, Richard Evans, that was a decent book, and I think I'm going to read the sequel to this, which is The Third Reich in Power. So this was the Avid Reader's review of The Coming of the Third Reich, written by Richard Evans in 2003. I hope you enjoyed this book review, and I will see you guys next time.